June 1944, the night before the Normandy landings. In the dark, cold water, a man crawls forward with no rifle, no machine gun. On his thigh, there is only a silent American knife that, in a few minutes, will help decide the fate of the Normandy landings. He is not a comic book hero. He is a U.S. Navy fighter in the water, and beside him move OSS agents, America's Secret Service. Their mission is simple and terrifying. Take out the guards without a sound, cut the mine wires without a shot, open a path for thousands of soldiers to the beach without a single mistake. This knife looks ordinary, steel, a handle, dark traces of oil, but it was not made to look pretty. It was sharpened for one job. Work in the dark, so close you can feel the enemy's breath. In school we hear about tanks, ships, and planes, but almost no one talks about how a small blade in a cold hand could ruin or save an entire operation. Who created these quiet knives for the OSS and U.S. Navy special units? How many lives did they take? And how many did they save on that night when the fate of Europe was being decided? And the biggest question, can one small knife in someone else's hand really change the course of the largest landing in history? June 5th, 1944, approximately 0200 hours. The English Channel does not care about history. It is cold, it is black, and tonight it is full of men who quietly expect to die before sunrise. Somewhere off the coast of Normandy, a small rubber raft slides through the chop. No engine, no lights. The only sound is the slap of water against the inflated tube and the ragged breathing of 6 men who have not slept in 32 hours. They are United States Navy combat swimmers, part of a Naval Combat Demolition Unit, an NCDU, and they are carrying enough high explosives to level a city block. But what matters right now is not the explosives. What matters is the knife. Strapped to the lead swimmer's thigh is a blade roughly 7 inches long, with a dark phosphate finish that drinks in moonlight instead of throwing it back. The handle is wrapped in leather, not for looks, but because bare metal slips in wet hands. The edge has been honed to approximately 15 degrees per side, sharp enough to part a hemp rope with a single, steady draw stroke. This knife was not designed to impress anyone. It was built to work in the dark, underwater, with numb fingers, against steel cable and barbed wire, and, if it came to it, human flesh. We do not know the swimmer's name. Classification and time have erased it. His mission has not disappeared. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel has spent months fortifying the beaches of northern France with what he calls his Devil's Garden, a lethal maze of steel obstacles, wooden stakes, and teller mines designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft and drown Allied soldiers before they ever reach the sand. The sea. Obstacles stretch from the waterline to the low tide mark, thousands of them, each one a potential catastrophe waiting for the first wave. In approximately 12 hours, the largest amphibious invasion in human history will hit these beaches. Over 150,000 men, nearly 7,000 vessels, the future of Europe riding on the first wave. And those men, all of them, will need cleared lanes through Rommel's garden. The problem is simple to state, nearly impossible to solve. Explosives can destroy the obstacles, but explosives demand careful placement. Placement takes time. Time demands silence. One alert sentry. One spotlight sweeping the wrong patch of water. One premature detonation of a mine wire. Any of these will bring machine gun fire down on men with no cover, no weapons heavier than a pistol, and no way to retreat across a mile of open sea. The knife is the answer to that silence. Not glamorous, not cinematic, but essential. That NCDU swimmer feels his way forward through chest-deep water, fingers searching the darkness for the thin steel cables that connect obstacle to obstacle, mine to mine. When he finds one, he does not signal. He does not hesitate. He draws his knife, positions the blade against the wire, and cuts. One clean stroke. No sound but the whisper of steel through steel. In that moment, he is not thinking about the 150,000 men behind him. He is thinking about the next wire, the next obstacle, the tide rising against his legs. History will remember what he cannot know. That single cut is one of thousands that night, each one a tiny decision that will help decide whether the first wave of Operation Overlord lands on a killing field or finds a path to the shore. The knife in his hand is not a relic of medieval warfare. It is a precision instrument, purpose-built by American industry and American ingenuity for a kind of war that has never been fought before. A war of shadows and silence. A war where the loudest weapon is sometimes the quietest one. This is the story of that knife, and the extraordinary men who carried it. If you are finding this kind of story compelling, consider subscribing. That simple click tells the algorithm to show it to more people like you. And stay with me, because what comes next explains how America, a nation that had barely heard of commandos in 1941, created some of the deadliest close combat weapons of the entire war. But first, we need to go back. Back to a time when many American generals thought knives were for Boy Scouts, and the British were about to teach them otherwise. 1941, Washington, D.C. While that NCDU swimmer was still a high school student somewhere in America, probably thinking about baseball, girls, and what to do after graduation, the United States military had a problem it did not yet know it had. The problem was knives, or rather, the absence of them. In the halls of the Pentagon, generals were obsessed with big things. Battleships with 16-inch guns, B-17 bombers that could drop ordnance from 25,000 feet, Sherman tanks rolling off assembly lines by the thousands. The American war machine was scaling up for industrial warfare, the kind measured in tons of steel and gallons of aviation fuel. Knives were afterthoughts, personal items. Something a soldier might buy at a hardware store before shipping out, or inherit from his father's war in 1918. The United States Army issued bayonets, of course, long, unwieldy spikes designed to attach to rifles for charges across no man's land. But a dedicated fighting knife, a weapon purpose-built for silent killing at close range, that was not in the manual, that was not even in the conversation. Then the British showed up. In late 1941 and early 1942, small groups of British commandos and intelligence officers began arriving in the United States. Officially, they were there for liaison and training coordination. Unofficially, they were there to teach the Americans everything they had learned about a new kind of warfare, the dirty kind, the shadow kind, the kind that happened in occupied France at 3 a.m., when a two-man team needed to eliminate a Gestapo informant without waking the neighbors. And they brought their knives with them. The Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife. If you have never seen one, picture this. A slender double-edged dagger, approximately 7 inches in blade length, with a distinctive foil-style grip, and a point so fine it could slip between ribs with almost no resistance. It was not a utility tool. It was not designed to cut rope or open ration cans. It was designed for exactly one purpose: killing human beings, quietly. The knife was the brainchild of William Fairbairn and Eric Sykes, two former Shanghai police officers who had spent decades dealing with some of the most violent street crime on Earth. They had studied knife wounds, they had seen what worked and what did not, and they had distilled that knowledge into a weapon of focused lethality and a training doctrine to match. The doctrine was simple and brutal. Strike for the subclavian artery, the kidneys, the throat. Move fast, move silent, and never, ever hesitate. American officers watched these demonstrations with a mixture of fascination and horror. This was not the war they had imagined. This was not cavalry charges and artillery barrages. This was killing at arm's length. Professional, systematic, and, in occupied territory, absolutely necessary. The problem facing American military planners was suddenly clear. If the United States was going to fight in occupied Europe, and it was, then it needed men who could do this work. And those men needed tools. The task fell to an organization that, in 1942, barely existed. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, America's first real spy agency, created by executive order and led by William Wild Bill Donovan, a World War I hero with a Medal of Honor and a taste for unconventional thinking. Donovan understood immediately what the British were offering. He understood that the next war would be fought not just on battlefields, but in bedrooms, in alleyways, in the quiet spaces between enemy lines. He understood that America needed its own silent weapons. And so, in training camps scattered across Maryland and Virginia, a new generation of American operatives began learning the Fairbairn Sykes method. They practiced on dummies dressed in German uniforms. They memorized the location of every major artery in the human body. They learned to draw, strike, and withdraw in a single fluid motion. 3 seconds, no more. For many of them, young men from farms and factories who had never imagined this kind of war, the training was a moral shock. But they learned. They had to. Because somewhere in Washington, maps were being unrolled, and plans were being drawn, and the beaches of northern France were already circled in red. The British had shown America what was possible. Now, America needed to build its own arsenal. Blades designed not for British commandos, but for American hands, American missions, American wars. What came next would change the nature of close combat forever. The arsenal America needed did not exist in 1942, so they built it. The Office of Strategic Services was, by any conventional standard, an impossible organization. It had no precedent in American history, no institutional memory, no established doctrine to lean on. What it did have was money, urgency, and a director who believed that strange problems demanded strange answers. Wild Bill Donovan recruited from everywhere. Ivy League professors who spoke 6 languages, safecrackers from Chicago, Hollywood stuntmen, anyone with a useful skill and a willingness to live in the gray zones of warfare. He sent them to training facilities with innocent-sounding names. Area B in Maryland, The Farm in Virginia, where British instructors waited with lesson plans written in blood. The curriculum was not subtle: silent killing, lock-picking, explosives, forgery, and always, always the knife. But the Fairbairn Sykes dagger, elegant as it was, presented problems for American use. It was a pure fighting weapon, exceptional for assassination, but too delicate for rough field work. The thin blade could snap if used to pry open a window frame. The fine point could bend against bone if the angle was wrong. American operatives needed something more versatile. The answer came from a designer named John Eck, and, separately, from military procurement officers who understood that American manufacturing could refine and harden British concepts. The result was the OSS Stiletto, approximately 6.5 inches of blade, double-edged like the Fairbairn Sykes, but slightly thicker along the spine for durability. A cast metal handle with a skull crusher, pommel that could serve as an emergency impact weapon. The whole package weighed roughly 8 ounces, light enough to forget you were carrying it until the moment your life depended on it. This was a contact weapon, built for work measured in inches, not yards. But the OSS also recognized that not every job required surgical precision. Sometimes an operative needed to fight through an obstacle, not slip around it. Sometimes silence mattered less than sudden, overwhelming violence. For those missions, there was the Smatchet. The Smatchet looked like something from a nightmare. A broad, leaf-shaped blade roughly 10 inches long with a weight-forward balance designed for chopping. It was ugly. It was brutal. It looked less like a regulation military sidearm and more like something a medieval executioner might carry. That was precisely the point. Colonel Rex Applegate, one of the OSS's chief close combat instructors, described the Smatchet's purpose in characteristically blunt terms. It was designed to chop through bone, muscle, and heavy clothing in a single stroke. Where the stiletto was a scalpel, the Smatchet was a cleaver. Both had their place in the Shadow War. In OSS training camps, recruits practiced with both. They stabbed sandbags until their arms ached. They chopped pig carcasses hanging from ropes, learning the sickening sensation of blade meeting meat. They drilled in darkness, drawing and striking by feel alone until the movements became automatic and terrifyingly smooth. The men who survived this training emerged changed. They had crossed a psychological line that most soldiers never approached. They had learned to kill not from a distance, with rifles and artillery, but close enough to smell an enemy's sweat, close enough to feel the breath stop. The OSS was building killers, but across the wider military establishment, another group was learning a different lesson, that sometimes the knife was not a weapon at all. Sometimes it was a tool, a key, a way through wire and water and darkness to the other side. The United States Navy was about to discover what their swimmers really needed. The OSS was learning to kill silently. The United States Navy was learning something different: how to survive. In 1943, American military planners faced a problem no army in history had solved on such a scale. The Pacific was a shooting gallery of fortified islands. Europe was a wall of coastal defenses. To win either war, the Allies would need to land thousands of men on beaches the enemy had spent years turning into death traps. The landing craft existed. The troops existed. The willpower existed. What did not exist was a reliable way to clear the water before the first boats arrived. Reconnaissance photos told a grim story. Japanese and German engineers had turned shallow coastal waters into killing zones. Steel hedgehogs, crossed beams designed to rip holes apart, concrete tetrahedrons, wooden stakes driven into the sand at angles calculated to impale incoming craft, and everywhere, mines, teller mines, pressure mines, tripwire mines connected by cables that ran invisibly beneath the surf. A landing craft hitting one of these obstacles at 8 knots would come apart. Its 30 occupants would die before firing a single shot. The Navy needed men who could go in first, before the boats, before the bombardment, before anyone realized the invasion had begun. They needed swimmers. The Naval Combat Demolition Units, NCDUs, were born from this necessity. Small teams, typically 6 men, trained to approach hostile beaches in darkness, locate obstacles by touch, attach explosives, and withdraw before detonation. They would work in water ranging from chest deep to over their heads. They would carry no weapons heavier than a pistol. They would have no support, no cover, and no margin for error. The work was not glamorous or heroic in the movie sense. It was cold, exhausting, and terrifying. And it depended absolutely on the knife, not for killing, though that remained possible, but for cutting. The obstacles were tied together by cables. The mines were linked by tripwires. The beaches were wrapped in barbed wire that could snag a swimmer and hold him until the tide rose over his head. A standard military knife would not do. The blade had to be tough enough to bite through steel cable without chipping. The edge had to survive repeated strokes against wire. The handle had to lock into a wet grip and stay there. The sheath had to ride flat against the body, reachable in any position, above or below the waterline. Navy procurement officers worked with manufacturers like Camillus, K-Bar, and Colonial to develop blades that met these demands. The resulting knives were not elegant. They were not optimized for silent assassination. They were working tools, approximately 7 inches of high-carbon steel with thick spines, heavy grinds, and handles wrapped in leather or stacked with fiber washers for grip. Functional, reliable, brutal in their simplicity. NCDU swimmers trained with these knives obsessively. They cut rope underwater until their hands cramped. They sawed through cable in total darkness, measuring progress by feel alone. They learned to free themselves from tangled wire with one hand while holding their breath. Because on the real beach, there would be no second chances. By late 1943, the NCDUs were ready. The OSS was ready. The knives were sharp, the explosives were packed, and the maps of Normandy were covered in red circles marking every obstacle that needed to disappear. All that remained was the waiting, and the final, terrible preparations for the longest day. By spring 1944, everyone knew it was coming. The Germans knew. The British and Americans knew. Even the French resistance, scattered in small, isolated cells across occupied territory, understood that the invasion was no longer a question of if, only when. What no one knew, except a handful of men at the very top of Allied command, was where it would hit, and on what exact day. The answer was Normandy. The date was June 5, 1944, later pushed back by 24 hours when the weather turned against them. But for the men who would go in first, the waiting had already become unbearable long before any date was inked on an order. In English villages with names like Salcombe and Dartmouth, NCDU teams checked their gear for what felt like the 100th time. Explosives, fuses, waterproof bags, and knives, always the knives, oiled, sharpened, tested again and again against rope and wire until the edges almost sang under their thumbs. Across the country, in manor houses requisitioned by the OSS, Jedburgh teams prepared for a different kind of mission. These were 3-man units, usually 1 American, 1 British officer, and 1 French liaison, trained to parachute behind enemy lines and link up with the resistance. Their job was controlled chaos, blow up rail lines, ambush convoys, assassinate collaborators, and tie down German units that might otherwise rush toward the beaches. Their kit was eclectic: Sten guns, plastic explosives, forged identity papers, cyanide capsules sewn into coat linings for the moment when capture was worse than death, and knives. The OSS stiletto rode in a sheath under the arm, invisible beneath a civilian jacket. The smatchet, for those who accepted the extra weight, was strapped to a pack, waiting for the instant when subtlety would give way to raw force. Some men carried both. Others brought personal blades, family knives ground and reshaped to military standards. Whatever they chose, the knife was the one weapon that could not jam, could not run out of ammunition, and could not betray its user with sound. The night before embarkation, rituals varied. Some men wrote letters home, some played cards, some prayed. A surprising number simply slept, the deep, dreamless sleep of bodies emptied by training, fear, and resignation. But almost all of them, at some point, reached down and touched their knives. It was not exactly superstition. It was something older, something that tied these 20th century warriors to every soldier who had ever gone into battle with a blade at his side. The knife was real, solid. In a war of abstractions, tonnage, air superiority, strategic bombing, the knife was something a man could feel in his hand and understand without a briefing. One NCDU veteran, interviewed decades later, described the feeling in plain words. Everything else could fail: the radios, the explosives, the boats. But the knife was mine. If everything went to hell, I still had that. On the evening of June 5th, 1944, the first teams began moving toward the water. The channel was rough. The sky hung low and overcast. Somewhere beyond the dark horizon, the largest naval armada ever assembled was already underway. 7,000 vessels carrying American, British, Canadian, and Allied troops toward a 50-mile stretch of French coastline. But before the armada came, the swimmers. Before the soldiers came, the shadows. And in the darkness, blades were drawn. The waiting was over. The next hours would be recorded in blood, seawater, and steel. What happened on those beaches would decide the fate of Europe and test every knife, every man, and every silent skill that America had spent 3 years preparing. The blades were drawn. But drawing steel is not the same as using it. Before Normandy, before the cold Channel water and Rommel's Devil's Garden, there was training. And training for silent killing was unlike anything the American military had ever attempted. At Fort Pierce, Florida, NCDU candidates learned the water. They swam until their muscles failed, then swam more. They held their breath until their vision darkened. They cut through underwater obstacles while instructors timed them with stopwatches, shouting that slower meant dead. The knife drills were relentless. Cut a rope in total darkness, 5 seconds maximum. Cut a steel cable underwater with numb fingers, 10 seconds. Free yourself from tangled barbed wire while a wave pushes you toward the obstacle you are trying to destroy. No time limit, just survival. In Maryland and Virginia, OSS recruits faced a different curriculum. Their targets were no longer ropes and cables. Their targets were men. British instructors, veterans of Shanghai, of North Africa, of raids that never made the newspapers, demonstrated techniques with clinical precision. The subclavian artery, located just behind the collarbone, sever it, and a man loses consciousness in approximately 4 seconds, dies in under a minute. The kidneys approach from behind. A strike here produces instant shock, silent collapse. The throat, the most instinctive target, effective but messy. Blood spray, gurgling, noise. Better to avoid the throat unless absolutely necessary. American recruits practiced on dummies first. Sandbags dressed in German uniforms, hung from wooden frames. They stabbed until their arms burned. They learned to feel the difference between fabric and flesh, between rib and soft tissue. Then came the pig carcasses. Hanging from ropes in the Carolina woods, the carcasses were the closest approximation to a human body that training could provide. Similar muscle density, similar resistance. The recruits struck them again and again, learning the sickening truth of what a knife does to living tissue. Some men vomited, some quit. Those who remained understood something that no manual could teach. killing with a knife, is not abstract, it is not distant. It is the most intimate act of violence a human being can perform. And intimacy leaves marks on the body of the enemy and on the soul of the man holding the blade. The training was brutal, but training is not war. War came first in places most Americans had never heard of. Dusty Italian villages, moonless Balkan forests, and nameless beaches far from Normandy. The knives were about to draw their first blood in combat. The training was over, the theory ended. Now came the test. Before the beaches of France, American blades drew first blood in places the newsreels barely mentioned. The rocky coasts of North Africa, the shattered villages of Sicily, the mountain passes of mainland Italy. These were the proving grounds, rough dress rehearsals for the night that would follow in Normandy. And the lessons were brutal. In November 1942, Operation Torch brought American forces to North Africa for the first time. Among them were OSS operatives tasked with making contact with French resistance cells and, when necessary, eliminating enemy agents who threatened the landings. One documented account describes an OSS officer in Algiers who spent 3 weeks posing as a French merchant. His mission was simple to state and hard to execute: identify a Vichy collaborator feeding information to German intelligence. When the target was finally confirmed, the officer followed him into a narrow alley near the Kasbah. The stiletto worked exactly as designed. One thrust angled upward beneath the ribs. The collaborator made no sound louder than a cough and crumpled where he stood. He was dead before he hit the cobblestones. The officer walked away, caught a taxi, and reported the mission complete. 30 seconds of violence, weeks of preparation, a lifetime of memory. But not every mission went cleanly. In Sicily, July 1943, an NCDU team carried out one of its first combat swims, a reconnaissance of beach obstacles before the main landings. The water was warmer than the English Channel, but the defenses were just as lethal: mines, wire, stakes. One swimmer, working in darkness, felt his knife slip against a cable slick with algae. The blade skidded, the cable held. He tried again, sawing frantically, aware that every extra second increased the chance of detection. On the third stroke, the cable finally parted, but the delay had cost precious time. Elsewhere on that same beach, another team was not so fortunate. A sentry, alerted by some faint sound or simple instinct, swept a flashlight across the waterline. Gunfire erupted. 2 swimmers were hit before they could submerge, their silhouettes framed for a heartbeat in the beam. The knives had not failed. The men had not failed. But war does not grade on effort. Sometimes luck decides. Sometimes the enemy is simply faster. The survivors carried these lessons back to England, where the planning for Normandy was entering its final phase. They knew now, in their bones, what worked and what did not. They knew that the knife was no magic talisman. It was a tool, only as good as the hand that held it and the moment that allowed its use. They also knew that Normandy would be different, bigger, louder, more unforgiving. The real test was still ahead. The lessons from North Africa and Sicily arrived in Washington, wrapped in classified cables and long debriefing reports. The message was clear. America needed more knives, thousands more, and it needed them fast. By early 1944, the invasion of France was no longer a distant possibility. It was an industrial deadline. Every factory, every forge, every skilled craftsman who could shape steel was pressed into service. The arsenal of democracy was not only turning out tanks and planes, it was turning out blades. The numbers were staggering. K-Bar, the company whose name would become synonymous with the American fighting knife, produced over 1 million knives during the war. Camillus Cutlery, working under government contract, turned out combat blades at a rate of thousands per week. Smaller manufacturers, Case, Colonial, Payel, and others, contributed their own patterns, each slightly different, all built to the same brutal specifications. High carbon steel, blades between 6 and 7 inches. Full tang construction, meaning the steel ran continuously from tip to pommel, eliminating weak points. Handles made from stacked leather washers, compressed and shaped to fit the human hand. Phosphate or parkerized finishes to fight rust and kill any glint of reflected light. These were not elegant weapons. They were not meant as collector's pieces. They were tools, built to be used hard, abused in salt water and mud, and replaced without sentiment when they finally failed. The logistics of distribution were a war in themselves. Crates of knives moved by rail from factories in upstate New York and Ohio to ports along the Atlantic coast. From there, they crossed the ocean in the holds of Liberty ships, packed alongside ammunition, rations, vehicles, and the 1,000 other necessities of invasion. In England, supply sergeants unpacked them, checked for warped blades or loose handles, and issued them to units preparing for embarkation. Each knife was just one small object in a vast machine, but each knife eventually found a hand, and that hand belonged to a man with a name, a hometown, and a family waiting for news. One documented shipment, dated April 1944, lists roughly 4,200 combat knives destined for NCDU teams training in Devon. Another manifest records about 800 OSS stilettos bound for a classified facility in Scotland. Numbers on a sheet of paper, steel in a crate, until the moment they became something else entirely. The arsenal was built, the blades were sharp, the ships were loaded. Now came the hardest part, the final night, when men, who had trained for months, sat alone with their knives, their thoughts, and the knowledge that tomorrow would change everything. June 5th, 1944. Evening. Across southern England, approximately 156,000 men waited. They waited in barracks and tents. They waited on ships rolling gently at anchor. They waited in aircraft hangars beside C-47 transports that would carry them into the darkness over France. And in that waiting, each man did his own private arithmetic of survival. The odds were not good. Everyone knew it. Intelligence estimates predicted casualty rates as high as 70% for the first wave at Omaha Beach. Paratroopers expected to be scattered across miles of unfamiliar countryside, fighting alone or in small fragments until they could link up, if they could link up at all. NCDU swimmers knew they would be working in the surf, while German machine guns enjoyed clear, overlapping fields of fire. In that cold calculus, the knife became something more than a tool. It became a talisman. In the dim light of transport ships, NCDU men performed their final rituals. They greased their blades with a thin film of oil, guarding the steel from the corrosive bite of salt water. They checked their sheaths, making sure the knives would clear leather cleanly, even with numb, frozen fingers. Some wrapped tape around the handles for extra grip. Others scratched initials into the pommel, a small claim of ownership on an object that might outlast its owner. On airfields across England, paratroopers prepared in their own way. Many strapped secondary knives to their boots or ankles, insurance against losing their primary weapons in the chaos of a night drop. The M3 trench knife was standard issue, a 6 3/4-inch blade with a narrow profile built for thrusting. But some men carried personal blades instead, hunting knives from home, or folding knives inherited from fathers and grandfathers. One paratrooper, a sergeant from Ohio, later recalled tucking a small pocket knife into his jump boot. "It was my dad's," he said. "Didn't think it would save my life. Just wanted something from home close to me." OSS and Jedburgh teams checked their kits one final time. Stiletto under the arm, smatch it in the pack, radio crystals memorized. Cyanide pills sewn into the collar for the moment when capture might become worse than death. The conversations that night were quiet, forced jokes about French wine, promises to meet at specific Paris cafes after the war, silences that stretched a little too long, and always, the same unconscious gesture. A hand drifting to the knife, touching the handle, confirming it was still there, still ready, still waiting, like its owner, for dawn. The night passed slowly. Then, it passed completely. And in the gray light of June 6th, 1944, the waiting ended forever. June 6th, 1944, H hour. The waiting ended in thunder. At approximately 0630, the first assault waves hit the beaches. Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sword. 5 stretches of sand that would become shorthand for courage, slaughter, and the turning point of the war. But before the thunder, there was silence. In the pre-dawn dark, NCDU teams were already in the water. They had slipped into the surf hours before the main assault, swimming toward Rommel's obstacles with nothing but explosives, wire cutters, and knives. The work was exactly what they had trained for. and nothing like training at all. One NCDU veteran described it decades later. The water was cold enough to stop your heart. You could not see anything. You just felt your way forward, hand over hand, until you touched metal. Then you worked. Working meant cutting, cable after cable, wire after wire. The knives moved through the darkness, severing the hidden lines that tied obstacle to obstacle, mine to mine. Each cut was a small victory. Each cut opened a path that might save 100 lives, or 1,000. On Omaha, the carnage was extraordinary. German machine guns opened up as the first landing craft dropped their ramps. Men died in the water. Men died on the sand. Men died tangled in the very obstacles the NCDUs were still trying to clear. The carefully planned demolition timetable collapsed into raw chaos. Some teams managed to complete their missions. Others were wiped out before they could place a single charge. That morning, the knives ended up doing jobs no instructor had ever listed on a training syllabus. Cutting men free from gear snagged on steel and timber, slashing life jacket straps to keep wounded soldiers from rolling the face down and drowning, prying open jammed ammunition boxes when fingers were too numb and time was too short. In the arithmetic of survival, the blade became whatever it needed to be. Inland, the story was different, but no less brutal. Paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had jumped into darkness and been scattered across the Norman countryside. Many landed miles from their intended drop zones. Alone or in small clusters, they fought through hedgerows and farm roads, navigating by instinct, rumor, and desperation. For some of these men, the knife was, for a few crucial seconds, the only real option. One documented account describes a pathfinder near Sainte-Mère-Église who ran headlong into a German sentry. No shot was fired. The M3 trench knife did its work in silence, and the pathfinder moved on to mark the drop zone for the waves that followed. Small moments. Quiet violence. Decisions made in ditches and lanes that the big history books would never single out by name. The beach ran red. The hedgerows filled with dead. And somewhere inside that chaos, American knives did exactly what they had been built and carried to do. By nightfall, the beaches were secure, just barely. The price had been staggering, but the line had held. The path into France was open, and for the men who survived, men whose hands still remembered the feel of wet steel and resisting cable, the war was only beginning. The guns fell silent. Not all at once, war never ends cleanly. But slowly, sector by sector, as German defenders broke off, surrendered, or died where they stood. By the evening of June 6th, the beaches belonged to the Allies. The cost was written in bodies. On Omaha alone, approximately 2,400 Americans were killed, wounded, or listed as missing. The sand that morning had been a flat gray. By afternoon, it was stained in layers of rust and brown that the tide would need weeks to wash away. And even then, never completely. Among the survivors, a strange stillness settled. One NCDU swimmer, his name buried in the classification that still shrouds many of these operations, sat on a broken section of German obstacle, his boots dangling in the shallow surf. Around him lay the wreckage of the morning, burned landing craft, twisted metal, abandoned packs, and shapes under blankets that no one wanted to study for more than a second. In his hands, he held his knife. The blade was still wet, not from blood. His work that morning had been wire and cable, not flesh, but from the channel water that had nearly taken him twice. The leather handle was swollen with salt and soaked through. The edge, once sharp enough to part rope with a whisper, was nicked and dulled from 100 frantic cuts. He cleaned it anyway, slowly, methodically, using a strip of cloth torn from his own undershirt. It was the only thing in that moment he could control. Decades later, speaking to a naval historian, he described that scene with uncomfortable honesty. I kept thinking about the guys who did not make it, kept thinking about whether my cuts were fast enough, clean enough, whether one more second on a cable somewhere might have opened a lane that saved somebody's son. He paused before adding, "You cannot know. That is the hell of it. You can never know." The knife in his hands had done everything it was built to do. It had bitten through steel, freed tangled equipment, opened narrow paths through Rommel's Devil's Garden. It had been exactly the tool the Navy needed, exactly when the Navy needed it. And in his mind, it still felt like nothing. The weight that settled on men like him in the months and years that followed was not pride, but a heavy, quiet guilt. Some veterans locked it away and never spoke. Others talked too much, circling the same stories again and again, trying to explain something that refused to line up with simple heroism. The knife became a symbol, not of glory, but of how close they had stood to random death, and how cruelly chance had chosen who walked off the beach and who did not. A reminder that survival is not the same as victory, and that the blade itself does not care who lives or dies. The beach was taken. The war moved on. For the men who survived Normandy, the knives went back into their sheaths, cleaned, oiled, checked, and ready. There would be more wire, more cold water, more dark nights on strange shores. And before the end, the blades would be needed again. The beaches were behind them, the war was not. After Normandy, the knives kept working. In the hedgerows of France, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, in the shattered cities of Germany itself, and half a world away, on islands whose names most Americans could not pronounce, the blades found new purpose. The European campaign demanded different things from different men. OSS Jedburgh teams, parachuted behind German lines, continued their shadow war. They coordinated resistance attacks, sabotaged rail lines, and, when necessary, eliminated collaborators and enemy agents. The stiletto remained their constant companion, riding beneath jacket and shirt, ready for the moment when silence meant survival. One Jedburgh officer, operating in southern France during the summer of 1944, later described a night raid on a German communications post. His team had cut the telephone wires first, standard procedure, then moved in with knives drawn. 3 sentries, he recalled. We took them in under a minute. No shots, no alarms. The garrison never knew we were there until the charges blew. Clean, precise, exactly as they had been taught. But not every use of the knife was heroic. In the chaos of liberation, old scores were settled. Collaborators who had betrayed neighbors to the Gestapo were found dead in alleys and ditches, knife wounds telling their own silent stories. The line between justice and murder blurred in ways no after-action report could capture or tidy up. The Pacific Theater offered its own brutal education. Navy underwater demolition teams, the successors to the NCDUs, cleared beaches at Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and dozens of smaller islands. The work was familiar: obstacles, mines, wire. The conditions were different: warmer seas, but coral that shredded skin, and Japanese defenders who fought with a ferocity that made even Normandy seem almost orderly by comparison. The knives adapted: heavier blades for hacking through tropical vegetation, serrated edges for sawing at rope crusted with coral and salt. The same fundamental tool, modified and tuned for new, unforgiving battlefields. By May 1945, Germany surrendered. By August, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan followed. The war was over. Approximately 400,000 Americans had died. Millions more, on every side, carried wounds, visible and invisible, that would never fully heal. And somewhere inside the vast machinery of demobilization, the knives began their own long journey home. Some went back in the hands of the men who had carried them. Some slipped into the pockets and duffel bags of souvenir hunters. Some were lost forever in the mud and water of battlefields the world was already trying very hard to forget. The fighting had stopped, but the story of the knife was far from finished. What happens to a weapon when the war ends? Where does the steel go when there is no more flesh to cut? The answers would turn out to be stranger and more human than anyone expected. The killing stopped. The paperwork began. In the months following victory, the United States military faced a logistical problem almost as complex as the war itself. What to do with the vast mountains of equipment that no longer had a purpose? Trucks by the 100,000, aircraft by the tens of thousands, rifles, helmets, boots, canteens, and knives. Millions of knives. The solutions were practical and unsentimental. Some blades went into warehouses, wrapped in cosmoline and stacked in crates, preserved for conflicts no one could yet name. Some were sold as surplus, turning up in hardware stores and Army-Navy shops for a few dollars apiece. Some were simply scrapped, melted down, the steel recycled into refrigerators, car parts, and the ordinary machinery of peacetime. But many knives came home in duffel bags. For the men who had carried them, these blades were not surplus. They were proof of survival, proof of service, proof of things that could not be explained to wives and mothers and children who had not been there. One K-bar, brought back by a Marine from Okinawa, spent 40 years in a toolbox in a Pennsylvania garage. Its owner never spoke about the war. When he died in 1987, his son found the knife beneath a layer of old screwdrivers and electrical tape, the leather handle still dark with sweat that had dried decades earlier. Another blade, an OSS stiletto, followed a different path. Its owner, a former Jedburgh officer, donated it to a university archive in the 1970s, along with his papers and photographs. The knife now rests in a climate-controlled drawer, tagged with an accession number, its history preserved while its violence is flattened into footnotes and captions. Institutional memory moved more slowly, but it was deliberate. When the OSS dissolved in 1945, its techniques and tools did not vanish. They migrated, first to the Strategic Services Unit, then to the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency. The training manuals were updated, the methods were refined, the knives evolved. The Navy's underwater demolition teams became the foundation for a new kind of warrior, the Navy SEALs, officially established in 1962. These men carried direct lineage from the NCDU swimmers who had cut through Rommel's obstacles on D-Day. Their knives were newer, the steel cleaner, the designs improved. But the fundamental truth remained unchanged. In the dark, in the water, in the silence before violence, the blade was still the final tool. The war faded into history. The men who fought it grew old, then died. But the knives endured, in museums, in attics, in the hands of collectors who paid thousands for steel that once sold for pennies. And somewhere along the way, the truth turned into legend. The truth was not dramatic enough, at least not for Hollywood. In the decades after World War II, the combat knife went through a transformation that had nothing to do with better steel or sharper edge geometry. It turned into a symbol, and symbols, unlike tools, are expected to look larger than life. The movies came first. War films of the 1950s and 1960s showed American heroes with knives strapped across their chests, gleaming in jungle light, ready for stage showdowns with enemy sentries. On screen, the blades grew longer, the fights grew slower and more elaborate. The real thing, a few seconds of ugly close-range violence, was turned into choreographed theater. Then came Rambo. In 1982, First Blood introduced audiences to a survival knife that had almost nothing in common with what real soldiers and special operators actually carried. The blade was roughly 9 inches long, with a sawback spine and a hollow handle that held a tiny survival kit. It looked impressive. It photographed beautifully. By the standards of real covert work, it was almost useless. The saw teeth could snag on clothing during a thrust. The hollow handle weakened the tang, creating a failure point right where stress was highest. Its sheer size made quick concealment nearly impossible. Everything real combat knives were designed to do, draw fast, work quietly, disappear into a sheath without catching on anything. The Rambo knife did badly, or not at all. But the myth was stronger than the reality. Soon, sporting goods stores were full of tactical knives with sawbacks, hollow handles, oversized guards, and aggressive styling. Magazines ran ads for blades that could survive anything, showing them chopping through car doors and airplane fuselages. The quiet workmanlike tools of World War II slipped into the background as their fantasy descendants took over the market. The men who had actually carried those wartime blades watched this shift with reactions that ran from dry amusement to open disgust. One NCDU veteran, interviewed in the 1990s, held up his original Navy knife, a plain 7-inch blade with a leather handle, worn smooth from decades of use, and compared it to a modern tactical monster his grandson had bought. "This one," he said, lifting the old blade, "cut through cable underwater in the dark at Normandy." He set the new knife down on the table without another word. The silence said more than any speech could. The myths kept growing. The movies kept coming. Each new generation met the combat knife, first through fiction, oversized, shining, and almost magical, long before they ever had a chance to encounter the real story. But the real knives are still out there, in museum cases with small white labels, in private collections wrapped in oiled cloth, in the trembling hands of the last surviving veterans who still know exactly what those blades felt like when they were wet and heavy and necessary. And their stories, as quiet as the steel itself, are still waiting to be heard. Myths fade, the truth remains. Today, more than 80 years after D-Day, American special operators still carry knives. The steel is better now. Modern alloys that hold an edge for far longer and resist corrosion in ways that would have astonished wartime metallurgists. The handles are made from synthetic polymers, textured so they stay in the hand whether it is bloody, wet, or numb. The sheaths are molded kydex, locking the blade in place, drawing without a sound. But the core reality has not changed. In the dark, in the water, in the moment when silence means survival, the blade is still the final tool. Navy SEALs, direct descendants of those NCDU swimmers who cut through Rommel's garden, undergo knife training that their World War II predecessors would recognize instantly. The techniques have been refined, the target areas updated, the drills made harsher. Yet the central lesson is the same. When radios fail, when guns jam, when everything else is gone, the knife remains. The same is true for Army Special Forces, Delta operators, Marine raiders. Each branch favors its own designs, has its own traditions, its own quiet rituals of blade and steel. But all of them can trace their lineage back to those first OSS stilettos and Navy utility knives that crossed the Atlantic in 1944. The legacy is not only military. In emergency rooms and trauma centers, surgeons still see wounds that echo older wars. Knife injuries have a particular character, a directness, an intimacy, that sets them apart from gunshot wounds or blast trauma. Doctors who treat these cuts and punctures are, in their own way, reading the same anatomy that Fairbairn and Sykes studied and turned into doctrine decades ago. And in museums, the original blades wait. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans displays combat knives recovered from Normandy, their labels carefully recording units, dates, and beaches. The OSS collection at the CIA Museum, closed to the public, visible only to those with the right clearances, holds stilettos and smatchets that still carry the tiny dings and wear marks of their wartime use. These are not just relics, they are witnesses. Each nick in a blade, each stain on a handle, each scratch along the steel hints at a story no documentary can fully recreate. The grip of a hand that tightened around this handle, a heart that hammered in the dark, a decision made in a few seconds that rippled forward for decades. The landings at Normandy were decided by ships and planes and the courage of ordinary men. But some of the most important choices were made in silence, with a blade, in the narrow space between one heartbeat and the next. The channel is quiet now. The beaches are tourist destinations. The obstacles are long gone, rusted away, or dragged from the sand for scrap. Yet, if you stand on Omaha at dawn, when the light is gray and the water is cold, it is not hard to imagine it. The whisper of steel through wire, the breath of a man who knows he might not live to see the next minute, the silence before the loudest day. And somewhere, in a glass display case, or in the back of an old veteran's drawer, a knife remembers what we do not have the right to forget.